Welcome, dear friends, to another cozy evening together. I'm Sam, your host, and it truly warms my heart to know you've chosen to spend your time with these stories. Each mystery takes care and affection to craft, and seeing our little community grow means the world to me. Thank you for being part of it. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss the next tale. Now settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let's turn the page to tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Morning After the Sale. The morning after the Christmas garage sale dawned clear and brittle, the kind of morning when frost painted the window panes in delicate lace and chimney smoke drifted lazily into the pale sky. St. Mary Mead looked its usual picture of peace, but by 9:30, the news had already found its way to every breakfast table. Mrs. Talbot, cheerful, bustling, and rather proud of her bargain-hunting skills, was dead. At the post office, the kettle had been boiled 3 times already. Mrs. Hartnell, brisk and self-important, poured tea with the solemnity of a judge, while Mrs. Price Ridley leaned in as though every whisper might be weighed in gold. "They say she just fell," Mrs. Hartnell began, tapping her spoon sharply against the cup. "Collapsed right in her sitting room. Poor soul didn't even make it to her bed." Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. "Heart, they think. Though she never did complain of it, did she? Quite spry for her age." Behind the counter, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, the gentle click of her needles the only rhythm in the room. She didn't look up, not immediately. She was counting stitches and also words. "A sudden death?" she said softly, as if to herself. "Those are seldom truly sudden, I find. Usually there's been something brewing for quite some time." The others paused. Mrs. Hartnell frowned, uncertain whether that was an observation or a rebuke. "Well, of course, you'd know more about such things." "Miss Marple," she said, in that half-teasing, half-fearful tone villagers used when they remembered her knack for seeing too much. "Oh, I shouldn't say that," replied gently, eyes still on her knitting. "But human nature does have a way of repeating itself, just like a pattern. One only has to notice where the stitches go wrong." There was a murmur of agreement, though no one quite understood her. The talk turned to what Mrs. Talbot had bought at the sale. "That little wooden jewellery box," Mrs. Price Ridley recalled. "A queer thing, really. Said it came from the vicar's attic. She was delighted, snapped it up for $1. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. "Was it the one with the brass clasp?" "Rather old-fashioned, if I recall." "Yes, that's the one." "Looked ordinary enough, though I thought the lining smelled oddly sweet, like almonds. You noticed, didn't you, Mrs. Hartnell?" Mrs. Hartnell looked startled. "Well, now that you mention it, perhaps I did. Though I suppose that's just polish." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, one corner of her mouth curving ever so slightly. "Almonds, indeed." The door jingled and young Tommy Briggs ran in with a telegram and cheeks pink from cold. "Inspector Craddock's been sent for," he announced proudly. "I think it's serious." The room fell silent. Even the kettle hissed more quietly. "Well," Mrs. Hartnell exclaimed, "that settles it. Must be something odd, or why call in the police?" "It isn't as though anyone expected foul play." "Foul play?" Mrs. Price Ridley repeated, lowering her voice though no one else was there. "Whatever would anyone gain from harming Mrs. Talbot?" Miss Marple looked up then, her pale blue eyes clear and thoughtful. "Oh, my dear," she said kindly, "people seldom harm others for gain alone. Sometimes it's pride, sometimes fear. And occasionally," and she added, returning to her yarn, "simply the desire to tidy up a little secret before it unravels." Her words hung in the air, like frost catching sunlight. Mrs. Hartnell shivered, though the stove was warm. The kettle whistled again, breaking the spell, and conversation resumed in a flurry of speculation. Debts, visitors, mysterious letters. Each theory grew more dramatic than the last, and Miss Marple listened with polite attention, as though every rumour were a precious clue wrapped in idle chatter. When at last she rose to leave, the others followed her to the door. The lane outside gleamed under the winter sun, and the snow on the hedges sparkled like dusted sugar. "Will you be calling on the Talbots' house, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Price Ridley, curiosity warring with apprehension. "Perhaps," she replied softly. It's a sad business. And I did promise Mrs. Talbot I'd bring her that marmalade recipe. Such promises ought to be kept, don't you think? The ladies watched her walk away, her small figure disappearing beyond the frost-tipped holly bushes. Behind her, the post office murmured again, each woman convinced she knew the truth, though none of them did. Miss Marple, however, already had her suspicions, and as she passed the churchyard gate, she thought quietly to herself that gossip, for all its foolishness, was rather like tea. Weak or strong, bitter or sweet, it always left a trace of the truth at the bottom of the cup. Inspector Craddock arrived just after midday, his boots marked with thawing snow and his expression wearing the polite fatigue of a man who'd rather be somewhere warm. He had been to St. Mary Mead often enough to know that a quiet death here seldom stayed that way once Miss Marple became interested. Still, he intended to do his duty quickly, file the report, sign the forms, and be on his way. Mrs. Talbot's cottage looked untouched by tragedy. The curtains were drawn neatly back, a faint smell of lavender polish hung in the air, and the hearth still glowed with embers. She might have simply stepped out for a walk, yet on the small table beside the armchair lay the wooden jewellery box, its lid open, brass clasp shining faintly in the afternoon light. Craddock bent over it, making a few notes. "Doctor says heart failure," he murmured, half to himself. Nothing unusual for her age. No signs of struggle. No valuables missing. From behind him came a quiet voice. "And yet," said Miss Marple, "you don't quite believe it?" He turned, a flicker of amusement passing over his features. "Now, Miss Marple, must you always suspect something sinister?" "I rarely suspect," she said mildly, setting her gloves on the mantel. "But I do notice, and there is something odd about this little box." Craddock gave a tolerant sigh, but curiosity tugged at him all the same. "Go on, then." She stepped closer, her eyes sharp but gentle. Mrs. Talbot was a thrifty woman. She would never spend even a shilling on something without purpose. "And look, see how the lining sits slightly uneven on that." "It suggests another layer beneath." He hesitated, then reached for his penknife and carefully lifted the velvet lining. Beneath it, a narrow compartment revealed itself, cleverly concealed within the woodwork. Inside lay a folded scrap of paper, yellowed with age. Craddock unfolded it slowly. One word, written in smudged black ink, stared back at them. "Forgive." The inspector frowned, reading it twice. "Forgive? That's all?" "Sometimes one word can carry quite a lot of meaning," Miss Marple said softly, "especially if it was written in haste or fear." He studied her, half sceptical, half impressed. "You think this wasn't natural, then?" "I think," she replied, "that Mrs. Talbot may have known something she wasn't meant to, and perhaps she decided at last to make peace with it." The wind rattled faintly at the window, stirring the curtains like a sigh. Craddock tucked the note into an envelope and straightened up. "I'll have this examined, but if it turns out to be nothing, I'll hold you personally responsible for wasting my time." She smiled, a faint twinkle in her eye. "I should be delighted to be wrong, Inspector." "It happens so rarely." He chuckled despite himself, though the amusement didn't quite reach his eyes. As he left, he glanced once more at the quiet figure by the hearth, knitting needles already clicking softly. She wasn't looking at him, but he had the distinct feeling she already knew far more than she'd said aloud. Chapter 2. Secrets in the Snow. The day of Mrs. Talbot's funeral arrived cold and pale, with a faint mist curling over the churchyard like breath over glass. St. Mary Mead did solemnity well. Black coats brushed free of lint, hats tilted just so, and eyes carefully downcast in respectable sorrow. But beneath that quiet mourning, curiosity simmered like a low flame. Inside the vicarage hall, tea was served from polished silver urns, and the best china came out, the floral cups reserved for such occasions. Mrs. Price Ridley presided at the table, ensuring everyone's grief remained both visible and decorous. "So sudden," she sighed, pouring tea with exaggerated care. "I can't help but think she hadn't the faintest warning." "Still," murmured Mrs. Hartnell, "she'd been troubled of late. Bills, you know." The draper mentioned she owed nearly £2. There was a soft clink of a spoon, the faintest intake of breath. Miss Marple, seated by the window, didn't look up from her knitting, but she noted the change in the air. Debt was an uncomfortable subject, too close to home for some, too tempting for others. Debts, perhaps, said Miss Weatherby gently, but she always paid her way, in time. I think there must have been something else worrying her. At that, the room grew slightly quieter. Mrs. Hartnell leaned forward. You mean the visitor? The man who came the day before she died? My niece saw him from the lane. Dark coat, London sort of look about him. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Speculation rose like steam, each version of the story changing subtly as it passed from mouth to mouth. A solicitor, perhaps? No, a tradesman. Someone she knew in secret. Every suggestion drew a hush of scandalized interest. Miss Marple listened without appearing to. Her gaze drifted across the room to where Colonel Radcliffe stood by the sideboard, polishing his spectacles, though they were already spotless. He had been unusually quiet today. When Mrs. Hartnell mentioned the jewellery box, a strange thing, that wooden one she bought, the Colonel's hand hesitated just for a second. A pause, brief as the flicker of a candle, but enough for Miss Marple to notice. I never saw the appeal of second-hand things, he said briskly, setting down his glass, full of dust and someone else's troubles. A mild chuckle passed through the room, easing the tension. But Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. She had seen the Colonel's wife whisper something to him earlier, a glance quick and warning. The smallest things often told the largest stories. When the tea grew cold and the mourners drifted away, Miss Marple lingered near the church door. Snow had begun to fall again, soft as ash upon the graves. The vicar, brushing frost from his sleeves, sighed. She was a good woman, Miss Marple. I hope she's found peace. I dare say she has, Miss Marple replied quietly. It's those still living who seem rather uneasy. The bells tolled once more, fading into the distance. In a village like St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple thought, words carried easily, but it was the silences that truly mattered, and today there had been quite a few. That evening, the village lay wrapped in a hush of new snow. Lamps glowed softly through the mist, and the air carried that crisp, clean scent that belongs only to winter nights. Miss Marple, returning from the vicarage, heard the hurried patter of boots behind her. It was young Billy Trent, the errand boy from the grocer's, cheeks red and breath puffing in clouds. Miss Marple, ma'am, might I tell you something? He asked, lowering his voice as though afraid the snow itself might overhear. About Mrs. Talbot's house, she smiled gently. Of course, Billy. A sharp eye is a gift not to be wasted. He shifted from foot to foot, excitement and fear warring on his face. It was the night before she passed, near midnight. I'd been delivering the last of Mr. Cooper's parcels when I saw footprints, fresh ones, by Mrs. Talbot's back gate. Big, heavy prints, not hers. I remember because it had started snowing not 10 minutes before. Miss Marple's brow lifted. And you're quite certain of the time? Certain, ma'am. The church clock had just struck 12. He hesitated, glancing around. And I thought I saw a bit of smoke too, like from a cigar. Didn't think much of it till this morning when everyone started talking. Miss Marple thanked him softly, slipping him a coin for his trouble, and turned toward Mrs. Talbot's lane. The snow squeaked under her sensible shoes as she walked, her mind quietly ticking through the details. Footprints after midnight. Cigar smoke. A man, perhaps. Or someone who wanted to be mistaken for one. At the cottage gate, moonlight silvered the path. The snow lay smooth now, but faint indentations still marked where boots had pressed deep into the frozen ground. She crouched, brushing away a thin crust of ice, and found a few dark flecks scattered near the fence post. When she lifted one to her mitten, the faint, unmistakable scent of tobacco rose in the cold air. She straightened slowly, eyes narrowing toward the hedgerow. There, caught half buried in snow, something glinted. She bent again, brushing carefully until her fingers closed around a small brass button, plain, military style, the sort found on older uniforms. Miss Marple turned it over, thoughtful. Not a common sort of button for St. Mary Mead nowadays. And yet she could think of one or two gentlemen in the village who might still favour coats of that make, Colonel Radcliffe among them. The night was still, save for the faint creak of the church weather vane turning in the wind. She stood a long moment listening, feeling the peculiar stillness that often follows a truth newly uncovered. Not snowflakes, but secrets, she thought, layered one atop another, each waiting to melt away and show what lies beneath. When she finally turned to leave, the village clock chimed softly in the distance. The sound carried over the fields like a reminder. Time moves forward, but footprints, once made, have a way of lingering until someone cares enough to follow them. Miss Marple did not hurry. She seldom did. She only walked home through the white silence, the button held gently in her gloved hand, her thoughts as sharp and bright as the frost underfoot. Chapter 3. The Widow's Visitor. The bell at Miss Marple's gate tinkled just as she was laying out her mid-morning tea. She looked up from the tray, thin cucumber sandwiches, a modest sponge cake, and her favourite rose-patterned cups, to see a tall gentleman standing by the hedge. His overcoat was of excellent quality, though faintly travel-worn, and his smile, when he removed his hat, was all easy warmth. "Miss Marple, I believe?" he said, stepping lightly onto the path. "Terribly sorry to intrude."
"I'm Henry Talbot, Mrs. Talbot's nephew." Miss Marple rose just slightly. "Indeed, I had no idea she had a nephew. Distant, I'm afraid," he replied smoothly.
"I live abroad. Heard the dreadful news only yesterday. Thought I'd come at once to collect her personal effects. Family mementos, you understand." His tone was sympathetic, practised to perfection. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Quite understandable. Such matters can be delicate. But I fear most of her things are still with the solicitor." "Ah, of course." He smiled again, too readily. "Still, I hoped perhaps some neighbours might have kept a few bits safe." There was something about his eyes, though. Cool, precise. They flicked about the sitting-room when she invited him in for tea, taking quiet note of every corner. The framed photographs, the polished mantel clock, even the knitting basket near her chair. His smile was pleasant, but his eyes counted every teacup in the room. She poured his tea herself, with gentle steadiness.
"Sugar?"
"One, thank you." He took the cup gracefully, yet his fingers lingered just a touch too long on the saucer's rim, as though weighing its worth. "You were a friend of my aunt's?"
"An acquaintance," Miss Marple said lightly, taking her seat.
She was fond of company, always hosting this committee or that. "Did she ever write to you about the sale she held last week?" He paused, cup halfway to his lips. "Sale?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, her tone innocent. "A rather lively one. The whole village came. Quite a success, I hear." He smiled again, but this time it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, yes. She did mention something of the sort, I believe." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she worked.
"I expect you'll want to see her cottage, then."
"That would be kind," he said, his voice just a shade too quick. "The sooner I have things in order, the better." She nodded, but her mind was far from idle. His shoes, polished but scuffed at the heel, his cuff missing a button, and that faint, lingering scent when he leaned close to take his cup. Cigar smoke, masked poorly beneath expensive cologne. Miss Marple smiled sweetly, as if charmed by his manners. "You must find our little village rather dull after your travels." He gave a soft chuckle. "Not at all, Miss Marple."
"There's more to see here than one might think." "Oh, indeed there is," she said, eyes twinkling.
"Far more." The vicarage smelled faintly of beeswax and hymn books that morning, as Miss Marple joined the ladies of the parish to sort through the leftover donations from the Christmas garage sale. Brown paper parcels were stacked neatly across the table, each labelled in the vicar's careful script. Clothing, housewares, miscellaneous trinkets. It was,
on the surface,
a simple business, organising what would be sent to the orphanage in Bath. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that charity boxes, like people, often carried secrets among their contents. She lifted the lid from the trinkets box and smiled at the assortment within. A brooch shaped like a thistle, a chipped china rabbit, and several lockets tangled in a nest of old chain. But When she reached for a small gold locket she distinctly remembered seeing at the sale, Mrs. Talbot's locket, oval, with a tiny engraving of ivy leaves, it was gone. Her smile faltered, though only slightly. "Curious?" she murmured, almost to herself. Mrs. Weatherby, bustling beside her, looked up. "Did you say something, Miss Marple?" "Oh, just that this box seems a little lighter than I expected," Miss Marple said gently.
"I could have sworn Mrs. Talbot's locket was among these donations," Mrs. Weatherby frowned.
"Oh, that old thing. Perhaps it's sold after all." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, though she doubted it. She remembered precisely where it had lain, nestled beside the china rabbit, unsold at the end of the day. She had even handled it, admiring the craftsmanship before it was placed in the charity box. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the window, where light glinted off the frosted garden. "Would you mind if I check through the smaller parcels, Mrs. Weatherby? I should like to be certain nothing's gone astray." "Of course, dear," said Mrs. Weatherby, though her attention was already on a stack of teacups that needed wrapping. Miss Marple quietly worked her way through the boxes, her movements calm, methodical. At the very bottom of one parcel, beneath a folded shawl and a stack of hymnals, she found what she was looking for, the locket tucked neatly into a handkerchief. She opened it with care. Inside, beneath the faint scent of lavender and age, was a small photograph. A younger woman, clearly Mrs. Talbot, and beside her a man with dark eyes, sharp features, and a faint, knowing smile. Miss Marple's knitting-honed fingers paused. The resemblance to the so-called nephew was unmistakable. The same brow, the same line of the jaw. Yet the photo was old, at least 20 years or more. She snapped the locket closed, her expression unreadable. Later, as she left the vicarage and stepped into the brittle, cold air, her thoughts were steady and precise. A man claiming to be a nephew, but whose likeness appeared in a locket kept so carefully, so privately, by the deceased woman, was no ordinary coincidence. She looked down the snow-dusted lane toward Mrs. Talbot's empty cottage, where smoke no longer rose from the chimney. "Sometimes," she murmured softly,
"the smallest trinket unlocks the largest lies."
Chapter 4. Gossip and Guilt. The sewing circle met that Thursday in the warm parlour of the vicarage, where the scent of tea mingled with lavender polish and a faint trace of wool. A gentle clatter of cups, the hum of conversation, and the rhythmic pull of thread through fabric gave the room its familiar peace. Outside, frost veiled the hedges. Inside, tongues loosened with comfort. Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting a soft grey scarf destined for the missionary sale. Around her the women chatted in that peculiar village way, half gossip, half confession, each remark stitched delicately between polite laughter. Mrs. Price Ridley, as always, occupied the chair of authority. Her thimble gleamed like a badge of office. "Such a tragedy, poor Mrs. Talbot," she sighed, guiding her needle with quick precision. "But really one must admit she had a flair for drama even in death," Mrs. Hartnell gasped. "Drama, my dear, how unkind." "Oh, I meant nothing unpleasant," Mrs. Price Ridley said, fluttering a hand, only that she liked to be noticed. All those mysterious letters she received, goodness knows from whom.
And always those secret meetings at odd hours. Miss Marple looked up mildly.
"Secret meetings, you say? Well, so it was said." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned closer, lowering her voice, though not her volume.
"You see, there was talk some years ago about her having, well, some hold over a certain gentleman."
"Blackmail, dear. Though of course one doesn't use the word in polite company." The room fell into a hush. Even the kettle on the sideboard seemed to pause its simmering. Mrs. Hartnell tutted softly. "Oh, really, Price Ridley?"
"You shouldn't repeat such things. But, my dear, it was common knowledge."
She hinted herself once, something about a letter she could use if ever needed. I dare say she wasn't above a little persuasion. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "And who might this unfortunate gentleman be?" she asked lightly, as though the matter were of idle curiosity. Oh, heavens, I shouldn't say.
"Only, well, it was someone rather respected."
"A churchman, perhaps?" Mrs. Hartnell gasped again, scandalized. "Or maybe not," Mrs. Price Ridley continued, enjoying the attention. someone of standing. But I've said too much already. Miss Marple gave a small, pleasant smile. Not at all, dear. You've said just enough to make things quite interesting. The ladies returned to their stitching, but the mood had shifted. The soft rhythm of thread and needle now carried an undercurrent of speculation. Miss Marple, meanwhile, allowed her mind to wander, quietly weaving what she'd heard into the growing pattern of suspicion. A woman who kept letters, who hinted at leverage, who died just after a sale involving strangers and valuables, and now whispers of blackmail. It wasn't merely gossip. It was motive. As Mrs. Price Ridley bent once more over her embroidery, she pricked her finger and let out a sharp hiss. A tiny bead of blood welled up, stark against the white cloth. Miss Marple's eyes lingered briefly on the stain. In the gentle rhythm of needle and thread, she thought, secrets do unravel themselves. The letter arrived the next morning, slipped neatly through the brass slot of Miss Marple's door. No stamp, no return address, just her name written in a firm, slanted hand. She found it resting on the hall rug beside her umbrella, pale against the pattern. For a moment she simply looked at it, then picked it up with the same calm care one might give a sleeping bird. Her kettle was singing softly when she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of plain paper, folded once. The message was brief, almost careless in its cruelty. She got what she deserved. No signature, no hint of sender, except for the handwriting. Miss Marple stared at the looping strokes, her eyes narrowing. She had seen those letters before, the same deliberate slant, the heavy downward pressure on the D. She remembered now, on the scrap of paper found inside Mrs. Talbot's jewellery box, the one that bore the word, forgive. She laid the new letter beside her notebook on the table, studying them both as the kettle sighed into silence. The match was unmistakable. Whoever had written this was the same person who had, in some secret moment, left a message for the dead. She thought of Inspector Craddock, earnest and methodical, always looking for the outsider, the travelling nephew, the unknown thief. Yet Miss Marple knew villages better than any inspector. Evil rarely arrived from the outside. It grew quietly among the hedgerows, watered by jealousy, resentment, and the kind of pride that pretended to be virtue. She poured her tea and watched the steam twist into the chilly air. Someone in St. Mary Mead, someone who attended church on Sundays and spoke kindly at fêtes, had hated Mrs. Talbot enough to wish her dead. Miss Marple took out her small address book, its pages worn from years of discreet observation. There were names: Mrs. Price Ridley, the vicar's wife, young Tommy Briggs from the post office, even Mr. Hewitt, the antiques dealer who'd helped at the sale. Each, in their own way, had something to lose, or something to hide. She thought of the sewing circle, of Mrs. Price Ridley's slip of the tongue. Blackmail, a word too large for the room it was spoken in.
And yet,
perhaps Mrs. Talbot had held a letter not unlike this one, a letter that promised ruin to the wrong person. Miss Marple folded both notes carefully, tucking them into her knitting basket beneath the half-finished grey scarf. To anyone else, it would look like the harmless clutter of an elderly lady's mourning. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. The village roofs vanished beneath a white hush. But beneath that calm surface, Miss Marple felt the tremor of truth drawing nearer. "Murder," she murmured, stirring her tea. "It seems, has come from within the village walls." Chapter 5. The Tale of Two Sisters. The library in St. Mary Mead had always been a haven of quiet industry, where the faint rustle of pages mingled with the ticking of the clock above the mantel. That morning, however, the hush was heavy with something else: curiosity, wrapped in concern. Miss Marple, seated by the window with a borrowed gardening manual she didn't intend to read, listened to the low voices behind the counter. Mrs. Phelps, the village librarian, was recounting one of her treasured fragments of gossip to anyone who would listen, though today her audience was conveniently only Miss Marple. "Terrible business about Mrs. Talbot," she said, shaking her head. "But I can't say I'm altogether surprised. There was always trouble in that family. Miss Marple looked up, the very picture of mild interest. Oh,
I hadn't realized she had family still living. Mrs. Phelps lowered her voice, leaning closer.
well, she did have a sister. Years ago, mind you.
Florence, her name was.
The two of them went into some sort of business together after their parents died, something to do with antiques and estate auctions. They did rather well for a time until that unpleasantness over the inheritance. Unpleasantness? Miss Marple echoed gently. Mrs. Phelps nodded. It was whispered Florence felt cheated. Their father left most of his savings to Mrs. Talbot, you see, and there was talk, quite improper talk, that she used it to buy her way into that cottage.
After that, the two never spoke again.
Florence left the village. Some said she went north, others that she married a tradesman.
And then nothing. Vanished from all accounts. Miss Marple set aside her knitting bag.
And you say they were in business together? Oh, yes, Mrs. Phelps replied. Florence was the clever one with numbers, and Mrs. Talbot had the charm. They held little fairs, appraised heirlooms, even arranged auctions in the nearby town. Then, after the quarrel, Mrs. Talbot seemed to lose interest in such things. She became, how shall I put it, more withdrawn. Perhaps lonely. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the frost-laced window-pane. Loneliness does make people curious, she said softly. Sometimes even desperate. Mrs. Phelps hesitated. Do you think her sister might be involved, Miss Marple? Oh, I never think until I know, she said, smiling faintly. But it's remarkable, isn't it, how quarrels of the past can linger like dust on a bookshelf. You may forget it's there until you brush against it. The librarian chuckled nervously. You do have a way with words, Miss Marple. Still, if Florence truly is alive, she'd be quite elderly now. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. But memory doesn't age as kindly as faces do. She closed her borrowed book with quiet finality, tucking it under her arm. The morning light had thinned, turning the library's air to silver grey. Outside, the world was peaceful, chimneys smoking, children's laughter faint in the distance. But in Miss Marple's mind, a new thread had begun to weave itself into the pattern. Two sisters bound by blood, divided by greed, and perhaps reunited at last, one by death, and one by guilt. What is family? She thought as she stepped into the cold, if not the first mystery we ever know. The vicar had asked Miss Marple to help with the sale accounts that afternoon, and so she found herself once more at the trestle table in the parish hall, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the faint, comforting scent of ink and old paper. Outside, the snow fell in small, deliberate flakes. Inside, the world felt hushed, as if waiting for something to be revealed. She adjusted her spectacles and turned the pages of a slim, leather-bound ledger, one she hadn't noticed before among the donation records. The vicar's wife, bustling nearby, explained, "Oh, that must be Mrs. Talbot's own list from the sale. She kept it with her till the very end. I suppose it should go to the police, really." "Quite so," Miss Marple said, though her fingers lingered on the worn cover. "But perhaps we might glance through it first, just to be tidy." The entries were written in a careful, looping script. Each line listed an item, a price, and a set of initials. Most were ordinary enough: lace napkins, 2 shillings, EP, teacup set, 5 shillings, HW, but one entry stood out toward the bottom of the page. Jewellery box, £1, 10 CR. Miss Marple sat back, her expression mild but her mind alert. "CR," she murmured.
How very interesting. Do you know who that might be? Asked the vicar's wife. Miss Marple nodded slightly.
"I believe so."
Colonel Radcliffe.
"He's fond of collecting such trinkets, though he never admits it."
And I recall noticing his rather distinctive ashtray at the sale, placed, rather conveniently, near Mrs. Talbot's table. The vicar's wife blinked. "Ashtray?"
"Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And Colonel Radcliffe has a particular taste for Havana cigars. Very few gentlemen in this village do. The ash found near Mrs. Talbot's back gate, well, I thought at the time it was peculiar. The scent was unmistakable." She traced the line in the ledger with her fingertip, thoughtful. "So that's where the ash came from?" The vicar's wife frowned. "Do you mean he might have gone to her house that night?" Miss Marple gave a faint, knowing smile. "Oh, I wouldn't leap to conclusions. But I do wonder what became of the jewellery box after the sale, and whether the Colonel ever truly purchased it, or if the transaction was
arranged differently. She closed the ledger softly,
her mind sifting through the growing tangle of facts. Mrs. Talbot's secret business ventures, her quarrel with her sister, the forged nephew, and now a retired colonel with a taste for expensive cigars and possibly for secrets worth far more than £1.10. As Miss Marple tied the ledger with string and handed it to the vicar's wife, she gave one of her small, unreadable smiles. "It's quite remarkable," she said gently, "how even the most honest accounts can conceal the most dishonest dealings." Chapter 6. An Evening with the Colonel. The Radcliffe residence stood apart from the rest of St. Mary Mead, solid brick, ivy trailing its walls, and a pair of weathered stone lions guarding the gate as if to warn away idle curiosity. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 7, wrapped in her pale wool coat and carrying a small basket of preserves as a hostess gift. Colonel Radcliffe greeted her himself, all charm and bluster, his booming voice echoing through the tiled hall. "My dear Miss Marple, an unexpected pleasure. Come in, come in. Frightfully cold night, what?" "Indeed, Colonel," she said with a mild smile, "but your fire seems quite determined to fight it." The dining room was warm, a little too warm perhaps. A roast joint steamed on the sideboard, and the decanter on the table gleamed ruby under the lamplight. It was the sort of evening meant to suggest hospitality, yet every detail felt slightly rehearsed, like a performance mounted for a very specific audience. They dined pleasantly enough, discussing the weather, the vicar's sermon, and the rising price of eggs. Miss Marple appeared content to let the conversation drift like smoke, but every so often she asked a question just sharp enough to make the Colonel glance over his shoulder as though checking for eavesdroppers. "I don't suppose you've heard any more about poor Mrs. Talbot?" she asked gently, cutting her meat with deliberate care. The Colonel froze for half a heartbeat before recovering. "Tragic thing, that. Damned shame. But these elderly ladies, hearts give out, you know." "So one hears," Miss Marple replied. "And yet it's odd. I happened to see your initials in her sale ledger. You purchased her jewellery box, I believe?" His fork clattered lightly against his plate. "What? Oh, that? No, must be a mistake."
"I never bought any such thing. Haven't the slightest interest in trinkets." "Of course," she said softly, "though I seem to recall you were fond of antiques once. Something about a music box from Devon, wasn't it?" He laughed too loudly.
"Good memory you've got there. That was years ago. Entirely different matter." Miss Marple smiled, serene as ever. "Quite so. Still one wonders why Mrs. Talbot would have written your initials in her own hand if there were no transaction. Perhaps she meant to deliver it later." The Colonel dabbed his brow with his napkin. "Nonsense. Don't know what the woman was about. Can't say I knew her well at all." A faint tremor ran through his hand as he reached for the cigar box. The match flared, catching the light in his glass. He puffed once, twice, and exhaled a pale ribbon of smoke. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the small movement, controlled, yet betraying the slightest shake. She smiled again, the picture of amiable composure. "Some men, Colonel," she said gently, "lie to protect their honour. Others, I fear, to protect their freedom." The Colonel's laughter faltered, then died. For a moment, only the clock ticked. The fire had burned low, and the brandy decanter had made its third quiet circuit of the table when Colonel Radcliffe grew looser of tongue. Miss Marple sat opposite, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her sherry barely touched. The hour had ripened into that comfortable twilight when men of pride begin to mistake a listener's gentleness for ignorance. He poured himself another glass, just a finger more, Miss Marple, to keep the chill out, and sighed, leaning back in his chair. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair, and for a fleeting moment he looked far older than his blustering voice suggested. "You know," he began, with the air of a man offering a confidence he may later regret, "people in this village, they don't understand what it means to have served. To have done things in the war that don't bear remembering, Miss Marple nodded softly. I imagine one doesn't forget, even when one tries. He stared into the fire. You'd be surprised what men will do when orders come down. Some call it bravery. Others would call it theft. Spoils, they said, though not for the men who bled for them. Miss Marple said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was the best companion to confession. He glanced at her, gauging her reaction. There was a matter.
In France, a farmhouse, abandoned by the enemy, we found, certain valuables, jewellery mostly. No one would miss it, they said, but someone did. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched in her bag, yet her mind moved quickly. And Mrs.
Talbot knew of this. He gave a short, humourless laugh. Knew? She was there. Not at the farmhouse itself, but later, afterward. She was stationed with a clerical unit near Dieppe. Got hold of a list of all the names involved. Foolish woman kept it.
Years later she turned up here, of all places, and, reminded me. Miss Marple tilted her head. Reminded you? His eyes hardened, but only for a moment. She hinted she might tell a few old stories at the next regimental dinner.
Said she was writing her memoirs. I didn't take it kindly. Paid her to forget the idea, twice, in fact. And did she? He hesitated, swirling the amber in his glass. For a while, but you can't buy peace of mind, Miss Marple.
Not really. Not when someone knows the price you once put on silence. The clock ticked between them, steady and judgmental. Miss Marple's gaze was gentle, almost sorrowful. I imagine it weighed on her too, the keeping of it. The Colonel looked up sharply.
Do you think I killed her then? She smiled faintly. Oh, Colonel, I think very little until I must. But I do believe guilt has many disguises, and perhaps one of them looks rather like you tonight. He opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. For the first time that evening, the bluster was gone. He raised his glass in a weary gesture toward the empty chair across from them. To the past, he muttered, and to the dead who won't stay buried. Miss Marple inclined her head, her voice barely above a whisper.
Indeed, Colonel. What price does one put on silence?
Chapter 7. Midnight in the Vicarage. The vicarage sat in a deep hush that night, the kind of English quiet that pressed softly against the windows. Snow fell again, slow, measured, unhurried, as if time itself had paused for breath. Inside, the fire burned low, and Miss Marple, wrapped in her grey shawl, sat beside it reading a rather unconvincing mystery novel. The clock had just chimed 11 when a sharp thud came from the front step. The vicar, half dozing in his chair, blinked awake. "Good heavens, post at this hour," he muttered. Miss Marple looked up, the faintest crease between her brows. "No postman would brave such weather, Reverend."
"I rather think we've had a visitor." They opened the door together.
The night air was crisp and biting, the lamplight from inside spilling across the snow in a golden rectangle. There, at the edge of it, sat a small, familiar box, its silver clasp glinting faintly. The vicar's wife gasped.
"That horrid thing again." "Oh, Miss Marple, I do wish it had stayed with the constable." Miss Marple bent carefully, her eyes narrowing.
"So do I, my dear. But apparently someone wishes it otherwise." She lifted the jewellery box, brushing away the dusting of snow. It was colder than she remembered, as though it had been sitting in the frost for hours. They carried it to the study, where Miss Marple laid it on a lace runner and opened the clasp. The familiar creak of its hinge sounded almost theatrical in the stillness. Inside, no longer the jumble of trinkets from the garage sale, lay only 3 things: a lock of grey hair, tied with a pale blue ribbon, the missing locket, tarnished and dull, and the folded scrap of paper she had seen before, the one with the word forgive written in smudged ink, but now something new on the lower edge of the paper, faint but visible beneath the lamplight, was the mark of a single fingerprint, fresh,
oily, unmistakable. The vicar leaned in, startled.
"Surely the inspector—" "No," Miss Marple murmured, studying it closely. "Inspector Craddock never touched this paper. He said as much when I asked him to seal the evidence. Whoever returned this wanted me to see it. The vicar's wife shuddered. But why bring it here? Miss Marple's expression softened, because whoever it is no longer trusts the police, or perhaps fears them. They wanted the truth to come quietly to my very door. She touched the locket with gloved fingers, easing it open. The photograph inside was the same, faded, smiling, the man with the two familiar eyes. But now she noticed a small scratch near the hinge, as if someone had pried it open with haste. Hidden beneath the image, she found a slip of tissue paper folded twice over. It was blank, except for the faintest trace of perfume, violet. Miss Marple closed the locket slowly, her mind already assembling the delicate puzzle pieces, the Colonel's confession, the anonymous note, the missing trinket, and now this deliberate return. Forgive, she repeated softly. A word chosen by someone with much to regret, and very little time to do so. The vicar frowned. Do you think it's a warning?
Perhaps, she said.
Or perhaps an apology. Outside the wind had picked up, brushing the snow from the eaves in soft sighs. Somewhere down the lane, a door closed quietly, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Miss Marple glanced toward the curtained window, her eyes sharp as a hawk's in the firelight. Someone's watching, she said simply. And I do believe they've been waiting for me to notice. Morning sunlight broke through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, turning the china cabinet into a soft shimmer of porcelain and silver. The day had the polite chill of late December, the kind that encouraged the village to linger over tea and conversation rather than brave the cold lanes. Miss Marple had made full use of that tendency. Her kettle whistled merrily, and on the small oak table by the hearth a silver teapot gleamed, freshly polished, or rather, purposefully so. She had invited a few familiar faces for what appeared to be an innocent gathering. Mrs. Price Ridley, with her pearls and sharp opinions, the vicar and his wife, both eager for company, Colonel Radcliffe, of course, immaculate in his tweed, and last of all, the charming nephew, who arrived with the easy smile of a man convinced he was in control. "Oh, what a delightful morning for tea," Miss Marple said, her tone all warmth and welcome. "Do forgive the simplicity of it. Just sandwiches and a bit of seed cake." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "My dear, no one makes seed cake as you do." "Ah," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But the real secret is in the serving, I think. Will you pour, Colonel?" "You've such a steady hand," the Colonel chuckled, taking the handle of the teapot with an exaggerated flourish. His cuff brushed the polished silver. His thumb left a faint mist of warmth that Miss Marple's eyes did not miss. He passed the teacups round, cheerful and loud as ever, but the tremor in his left hand betrayed him still. "Mr. Talbot," she said sweetly, turning to the supposed nephew, "perhaps you'll do the honours next. It's always interesting to see how differently people pour, some with patience, some with confidence." The man smiled, clearly pleased by the attention. "My aunt always said I had a good hand for delicate things." He lifted the teapot easily, wrist turning just so, and Miss Marple nodded approvingly. She noticed the faint smudge his thumb left on the spout's rim, a small, invisible signature that no one else in the room would think twice about. Conversation flowed like cream in tea, innocuous, even dull to an untrained ear. But Miss Marple guided it gently, as a fisherman guides a line. She spoke of family inheritances, of the kindness of neighbours, and of second chances. And every so often her eyes flicked toward the teapot, shining in the afternoon light. After an hour, she rose briskly. "I must fetch another plate of sandwiches. Do forgive me." In the kitchen, she placed the teapot carefully on a folded napkin and pressed a thin glass slide against each print she could find. A faint dusting of graphite from her sewing kit, borrowed for just this purpose, revealed the smudges like whispers of truth. Her movements were calm, practiced, unhurried, by the time she returned. The group had moved on to harmless gossip. Mrs. Price Ridley speculated about the upcoming New Year's fete. The Colonel grumbled about post-war rationing, and the nephew leaned back. looking entirely too self-assured. "Such good company," Miss Marple said with a smile, pouring herself a final cup. "You've all been so helpful. I do so appreciate it." When they left, the house fell silent again. Miss Marple set the teapot beside the folded note from the jewellery box. The same fingerprint gleamed faintly on each, an identical curve at the ridge, a small break in the line near the centre. She compared them through her magnifying glass.
"And there could be no mistake. The hand that poured the tea," she whispered.
Had once poured poison. She sat back in her chair, the soft ticking of the mantel clock filling the quiet. The pieces of the puzzle had begun to align, too perfectly perhaps. For now she saw what the killer had tried so hard to conceal, not only guilt, but fear. Outside, the church bells began to toll the hour. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, eyes distant but bright. "There's always one who underestimates the weight of a teacup," she murmured, "and one who forgets that silver remembers." Chapter 8. Truth Beneath the Holly. Snow fell in soft, deliberate flakes across St. Mary Mead that morning, layering the hedgerows and rooftops in a hush that made every sound feel amplified. The distant bell, a passing cart, even the faint creak of Miss Marple's front gate. The so-called nephew stood there, his hat dusted white, his expression tight but controlled. Miss Marple had written to him in the gentlest of words, suggesting a private word before he left the village, and though he had pretended indifference, curiosity, or perhaps guilt, had brought him. "Do come in, Mr. Talbot," she said, ushering him toward the fire. "I thought you might appreciate something warm before your journey." He hesitated before stepping over the threshold, eyes scanning the cosy room as if afraid of its comfort. "You're very kind, Miss Marple."
"I didn't expect such hospitality," she smiled, knitting still resting in her lap. "It's Christmas, my dear. One must be hospitable even when one suspects wickedness," he blinked, uncertain whether she jested.
"Wickedness?"
"Yes,"
she said, her tone mild. A dreadful word, isn't it? So old-fashioned. Yet it does seem to fit certain acts that can't be softened by excuses, like deceit or vengeance. His jaw tightened. "You've quite an imagination for someone so gentle." "Not imagination," she corrected softly.
"Observation." She set down her teacup with a delicate clink.
"I do believe your name is not Gerald Talbot at all. You are rather his son, Richard, I should think. The likeness is there, though softened by youth. Your father lost his share of the Talbot inheritance when your great-aunt changed her will. She destroyed the new document, didn't she? The jewellery box once held the only proof of it." For a moment he said nothing. The clock ticked in the stillness. Then, almost inaudibly, he exhaled. "You've a remarkable memory, Miss Marple. It's a curse, I assure you," she murmured. He moved closer to the fire, staring into the flames. "Yes, I'm Richard. My father died with nothing. Everything went to her. She called it fairness. But he never forgot. He wanted me to reclaim what was ours. After he passed, I found his letters, his bitterness." "I thought I could make her see what she'd done." Miss Marple watched him quietly. "So you came to the garage sale?" He nodded. "I thought she might have hidden the will somewhere, perhaps among her things. She recognized me at once, though. Her face," she turned pale, "said I was just like him. I asked for what belonged to my family, and she laughed, said there was nothing left to take. That's when she showed me the box. Empty. She told me she burned the will years ago. And that," Miss Marple said softly, "was when you decided to punish her." He turned sharply. "It wasn't like that."
"I didn't mean she was frail."
"She slipped when I tried to take the box."
"I didn't plan." Miss Marple's eyes, though gentle, did not waver. "Accidents seldom leave poisoned tea, my dear." He froze, then lowered his head.
"I only meant to frighten her. I put the powder in her cup because she said she'd tell the police about me."
"I thought, just a little, something to make her faint."
"But she died."
"I didn't mean to kill her." The confession hung in the air like the fading chime of a bell.
Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the garden where once there had been footprints and secrets. Miss Marple sighed, folding her hands. "You see, revenge, Mr. Talbot, Richard, never pays, least of all at Christmas. It costs more than any inheritance ever could." He sank into the chair opposite her, his shoulders shaking.
"I thought she destroyed everything." I wanted justice for my father. She destroyed a paper, Paul said gently, but not your future.
You did that yourself when you let bitterness write your choices. They sat in silence as the fire crackled between them. The old clock struck 11, each chime a quiet reminder of passing time and wasted chances. At last, Miss Marple rose and drew the curtains aside, letting the pale daylight fall across his face. "I'll send for Inspector Craddock," she said. "You'll tell him what you've told me. Perhaps he'll understand. He's a kind man beneath the uniform." Richard nodded, defeated. "You're not afraid of me?" "No," she replied with a small smile. "You've done your worst already. The rest is only truth, and that never frightens me." As he left, snowflakes caught in his dark hair. Miss Marple watched him go until the white path swallowed his figure entirely. Then she turned back to the room, to the teacup still half full on the table, and whispered to herself, "Even in winter, one must tend to the roots if one wants spring to come again." The church bells began to ring just after dusk, their tones soft and steady, rolling through the village like a lullaby. Snow had returned, blanketing St. Mary Mead once more, gentler this time, as if the world itself wished to smooth over the rough edges of what had been revealed. The streets glowed beneath the lamplight, smoke curling from chimneys, and the scent of pine and orange peel drifted from cottage windows. Inside the small parish church, candles flickered in brass holders, and holly wound round the pew ends, gleaming red and green beneath the soft golden light. Miss Marple sat near the front, her gloved hands folded neatly around her hymn book. To anyone watching she appeared as she always did, pleasant, still, self-contained. But behind her calm eyes, her thoughts moved with quiet purpose. It was over. Richard Talbot had been taken away that morning, his confession delivered with trembling sincerity to Inspector Craddock, who had listened gravely, then placed a hand upon the young man's shoulder. There had been no triumph in his face, only pity. Miss Marple had admired that. Justice, she thought, should never come with glee. The organ began its low hum, a familiar Christmas carol unfolding gently into the air. The villagers sang, their voices a little unsure at first, then warming together as if remembering that unity is its own kind of peace. Miss Marple joined them softly, her voice thin but true, carrying the words of forgiveness and renewal. Between verses, her gaze wandered over the congregation, the faces of friends and neighbours she'd known for decades. Mrs. Price Ridley, stiff in her fur collar, now far quieter than usual. The vicar's wife holding her husband's hand as if to steady him through the final hymn. Even Colonel Radcliffe, his moustache drooping slightly, had tears glinting at the corner of his eyes. Each had been touched in some small way by the events of the past days. Each, she thought, carried shadows of their own. Outside, the snowflakes caught in the churchyard lamps, descending in graceful spirals. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Talbot, the proud woman who had once ruled her household with tight fingers and a sharper tongue. Greed, pride, and guilt had wound through her life like ivy, until it choked even the smallest kindness. And yet, Miss Marple mused, there had been pity there too. So many sins began not in malice, but in pain. The final notes of the carol faded into silence, and for a moment no one moved. Then the vicar stepped forward, his voice gentle. At Christmas we remember not only joy but mercy. May peace, in all its forms, return to every heart here. The congregation murmured, Amen, the sound warm as a hearth fire. Miss Marple smiled faintly and gathered her shawl. She lingered as others filed out, watching as the candles guttered one by one, leaving only the great star in the east-facing window to glow against the night. Stepping outside, she paused at the gate, her boots sinking softly into the snow. Across the square, lights twinkled in cottage windows. Laughter rose faintly from the pub, where the younger villagers celebrated. Life went on as it always did, gently reclaiming its rhythm. Miss Marple looked up at the dark velvet sky, where the stars scattered like silver dust. "Beneath every Christmas star," she murmured, "there's always a shadow." But then she smiled. And yet, without the shadow, one would never notice the light. She turned toward home, the sound of her footsteps muffled by snow, her breath pale in the frosty air. Inside her cottage the fire still glowed. She poured herself a small cup of tea, placed a single candle in the window, and watched the village settle into its winter quiet. The kettle began to hum again, a gentle, familiar tune. Peace, she thought, was never truly lost. It simply waited for people to remember where they last saw it. And as the wind swept softly through the holly branches outside, St. Mary Mead remembered too.